In this video, we're going to talk about how we can get access to components inside of our scripts. So if we go back to our player, we've seen how you can access the transform inside of a script by typing transform with a lowercase t. But we can't do that if we want to get access to any of these other components. We have to use something else called GetComponent. So currently to move our player, we're adjusting the position on the transform. To move objects, that is a good method. You can do that. But once you have a rigid body involved in physics, you shouldn't be moving the transform directly. Once you have physics involved, you want to use the physics system to make movements. So we want to apply changes or velocities or forces to our rigid body to kind of push our player around. The way I like to think of this is you can think of moving using the transform as a way to kind of teleport your player around. So they're instantly going to move to a new position. Even if it's a very, very small position, what we're doing is moving that object to the new position. Now that's great for something that's just moving in your game. Say your background sky's scrolling past, or you have a platform moving up and down, something like that, where no physics are involved at all. But as soon as we have physics involved, we want to actually start applying a force to the player. So instead of just making them teleport to a new position, as small as it might be, we want to add a force that's going to naturally move that object. So to be able to do that, we need to start working with this rigid body 2D component. Now to see that, let's go back to our player controller. Now, as I mentioned, to get access to the transform, Unity has that built in. So we can just type transform with a small t, not a capital T, and then dot position or rotation. So Unity built this into coding so it's automatic because every single game object inside of Unity has a transform. That's the only component that every object has. So it makes sense to automatically have it here. We shouldn't have to do anything fancy to get to it. But once we start adding our own components to objects, now we have to find a way to get access to them. So we can do that, and then we can start accessing the settings inside of it like we did here with dot and then the setting name. So once we want to do it to a new component, what we need to do is type GetComponent, and then you'll see the autocomplete for it here. And this one's a bit different. Instead of using open and close parentheses, we need to use these angle brackets. Now inside of these angle brackets, this is where we have to put the type of component that we want to get. So in this case, we're looking for the rigid body 2D. So if we start typing, it's going to autocomplete, and we see it here, rigid body 2D. So now we're going to attempt to get a component of type rigid body 2D. And then now we do have to put the open and close parentheses. So it's a bit different of text formatting. The syntax is a little weird here, but this is one that's going to become very common to you. So now that we have this, if we look back at our player, and we can see the names don't always correlate one-to-one with the spelling. So what we can do, if we're not sure how to access one of these settings inside of the script, we can check the documentation. So if we look on the component, the little question mark here, if we click this, that's going to open the Unity scripting reference page for that object. So now this is the documentation page, and if we start going through, it explains what everything is here. But then if we scroll back up, we see one that says switch to scripting. So this is kind of the actual page in the manual explaining what the rigid body 2D is, how it works, what every setting does. So when you're learning a new component, this is a really great way to learn it, is to bring up the page and just start browsing through. There's going to be examples, every setting's explained, and there's really great documentation on this. But now if we want to know how to code with it, let's switch to scripting. And now we have the rigid body 2D scripting reference. So where it shows properties here, you can think of these all as settings that we can adjust from code. So if we want to change the angular drag, we can use angular drag, angular velocity, and so on. So in our case, we want to use the velocity of the player, or the actual rigid body in this case. So if we look down here, we see velocity, and it says linear velocity of the rigid body in units per second. if we want even more details on that, we can click on it. And it's going to bring up a page for that specific setting or property. It's going to explain it, and there's usually going to be examples as well. Okay, so here's where you can start viewing all the information. Let's go back in and I'll explain it a bit more in my terms here for you. So we get access to the rigid body 2D, and then we want the velocity. So we start typing velocity. Now if we put this, we can set equals, and now we can assign something to the velocity. So we can do something very similar to what we did with transform.position here, except we don't even have to take the current position and then add something new to it, because velocity, it doesn't matter where you are. Velocity is how strongly the object is moving in a direction. It's basically the speed. So you can think of velocity like when you're driving your car. If you're doing a certain speed down the highway, that's your velocity. That's the exact same thing here. So we're just telling it to move at this speed. So what we have to do is give it the direction. Let's take this same line here. So we can copy this one. Let's add it in here. I'm just going to comment out the transform.position one for right now. So we're using the same variable, the input. We're using the move speed. We don't have to use time.delta time now though. And the reason behind this is, as I showed previously, this determines how fast each frame loads on the game, and we adjust our movement speed based on that. Physics is a completely different system. So physics, Unity handles all of that for us in this rigid body 2D system. So we don't have to worry about how fast the game's running. Physics are always going to work the same. So remember, if you're working with physics, you don't want to use the time.delta time. And now the other thing, because we were adding this onto our current position, we were telling it add 0 for the Y value onto the current position. We don't want to do this because this is actually going to tell it to change the Y velocity to 0. So for the Y value, we need to actually tell it how fast to be moving on the Y. And in our case, that's going to be handled by a jump or falling with gravity later. So we don't want to change that. We want Unity to handle all of that. So in here, we need to tell it to keep its current Y velocity. Now to do that, this is going to look a bit confusing. So we got to do GetComponent again. We got to get the rigid body 2D. So the same syntax we used here. Then we got to do .velocity again, and then .y. Okay, so this is going to take the Y, and this line of code is getting pretty long here. I'm going to show you a better way to do this right away. But let's go test this out first and see how our player moves. So now if I run the game, notice our player is moving very similar. We could adjust the move speed a bit, just like we did before. So maybe let's go a little slower. Let's try 6. Okay. So for the most part, it doesn't seem like our player controller changed much. It slides a bit. One thing we'll notice too, when you let go, you do like a little bit of a slide before you stop. And that's because you have a velocity. So it requires physics for you to stop. When you stop pressing the button, you have a bit of momentum. So that's something we could leave in, or we can modify that later. That's a preference of your game. So you can think of some games like Super Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, Super Meat Boy, any of these platformers where you start running. Some of them, as soon as you let go of the key, your player instantly stops. Other ones, like say something like Super Meat Boy, you'll slide for a little bit once you let go because you have momentum from physics. Those are part of your game mechanics. That's entirely up to you how you want to make that as we progress here. But I'm going to show you how to control it, and then you can decide which way you want to work in your game. So we have that working. Let's go back to our script here. And now this code is starting to get pretty redundant here. We had to use GetComponent rigid body 2D twice. And the important thing I want to mention, doing this where you use GetComponent to find a component. So in our current example of what we're doing here, this isn't going to impact anything. It's very small in the grand scheme of things. But overall, using GetComponent here is very CPU intensive. So it's not something you want to do more than you have to. So if we look at it, in this case, this one line, we're using this call to GetComponent twice. in one line of code, and this is an update. So this is happening every single frame of our game. So if our game's running at 100 frames per second, this is running 200 times per second, where it has to search to find this rigid body. And you can see how if you have that in multiple places, that's going to add up quick and waste CPU resources. So we don't want to do this more than we have to. What we want to do is, just like anything else we made here, we can make a variable. So remember, we made a variable of vector2 and we called it current position, and it stores a vector2 in it. And then same thing with the float for input, float for move speed. So we can do the same thing here for the rigid body 2D. So let's make a variable of type rigid body 2D. I'm going to call it my rigid body. And this naming is your preference. You could name it my rigid body 2D. Another common one people will use is just RB. So this is a bit of a preference. Different people do different ways. But as far as the actual coding, it's not going to make a difference. And now what we want to do is get a copy of this rigid body right at the start of our game. So in start, let's do my rigid body. And then we want to assign into it the GetComponent rigid body 2D. So now we only have to do this once at the start of the game. And then after that, we always know where the rigid body is. So think of GetComponent as kind of like a search. So when you run it, it has to search through your whole player looking for something that is a rigid body 2D. When we do it this way, this is what's called caching. And it stores a reference to it right away. So anytime we need it in the future, all we have to do is use my rigid body. So let's change that here. Let's remove this GetComponent. Let's call this my rigid body. And let's do the same thing here. There. So not only does it run much more efficiently now, but it looks a lot cleaner as well. And now the same thing as always, I like to test my code before I assume that it's all working fine. So let's go run this, make sure it's still working. Okay, so we can move around using physics. And now that I confirmed it's working, I'm just going to delete these two lines where we use this to actually control how we move with transform. We don't need that anymore, and we don't actually want that. As I mentioned, moving with the transform is not a good idea. And we can delete this vector2 variable up here. Okay, so our code looks a lot more efficient now, and we're also controlling the player using velocity instead of moving the transform. So that's it for this video. I will see you in the next one.